In other news, President Cyril Ramaphosa is in Russia as the 16th annual BRICS Summit gets underway from today. Leaders from Brazil, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Iran, Russia, here in South Africa and the United Arab Emirates are all set to meet for the first time since new members were invited to join this bloc. That was last year. Let's get a better sense, though, of the different geopolitical dynamics that are likely to be at play. Bring in SABC News International Desk Editor Sophie Mokoena with us here in our studios in Auckland Park. Sophie, always great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for popping by. I'm actually spoiled for choice about where to start, given everything that's taking place in the world so far. But perhaps home is a good place to begin. President Cyril Ramaphosa arriving in Russia just a short while ago. Is there any telling what Team South Africa is bringing to the summit, given the fact that, there's so much to be considered?
Well, you know that he is the outgoing leader of the BRICS group. And therefore, I think him being there, it's quite important in a sense that he's going to give President Vladimir Putin a briefing in terms of some of the decisions that were taken here in South Africa, but also in terms of South Africa's presidency, what South Africa has achieved. You know that it was here in South Africa last year where there was a decision to adopt a resolution that this group must be expanded, and we saw some countries joining, and therefore I think South Africa will be able to speak and talk about what they have achieved, but also what needs to be done going forward in terms of strengthening this group, particularly when you look at trade relations, when you look at global challenges, when you look at issues of culture. And therefore, it is quite important, as you can see, the president of the BRICS Bank arriving there, Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil. And therefore, these are some of the issues. And as she is arriving there, you'd know that BRICS is also discussing the issue of how can member countries use their own national currencies to do business amongst themselves rather than using a dollar. And that will be linked to the discussion whether there should be a BRICS currency, and that one is going to be a difficult one. And when they were here in South Africa recently, the BRICS Bank president spoke about that issue of how member countries can work together using their own currencies to trade amongst themselves.
Absolutely. A lot of discussions around shifting the center of power and ensuring that this pack is able to, I suppose, play its own role. But before we get to that, what is not lost to us, of course, is that Russia is currently involved in active war. The question, I suppose, is whether or not any of those discussions, you reckon, will come up.
Yes, they will. I mean, there's no way President Putin can't use this opportunity to send a message to the West, particularly to the United States of America, around the issue of pushing for a multipolar world rather than a unipolar world. And he is going to be very, very firm, as you saw him receiving the president of the BRICS Bank, Dilma Rousseff. I can tell you there's no way President Putin is going to be diplomatic on these issues, because you know very well that this is very important for him. The other important issue is that he is going to touch on the war in Ukraine. He would want to assure member states that he's willing to engage in talks, but the West that is supporting Ukraine is dragging this conflict. And the issue of the Middle East, I think he is going to touch on that as well. Yeah,
lines of demarcation certainly drawn. Speaking of that, the summit is also going to see new members of BRICS arrive. I mean, there's the likes of Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran also joining the pack. To what extent do you reckon that might alter the dynamic of this particular gathering?
I think when you look at those countries, most of them, some of them from the Middle East, from the Gulf region, and with the current conflict in the Middle East, they would want to hear statements from member states around these issues. But also on the margin of BRICS, they will engage different leaders to talk about this issue. I think the person to target there will be President Cyril Ramaphosa. As you know, South Africa has been very firm in terms of the support for the Middle East question, in terms of supporting the Palestinians. And I think many leaders, those who are from the region or in the Middle East or the Gulf, would want to talk to him. And I think even the president would want to engage those leaders from the Middle East or from the Gulf, those who are members of BRICS now, and those who will be attending as people who have been invited to try and find a solution, or perhaps a way to send a message that something must be done and the peace process must start to ensure that both countries, Israel and Palestine, live side by side peacefully in relation to the UN resolution of the two-state solution. So I think that is going to be very critical.
Without a doubt. Outside of the ongoing conflict, and I have no doubt that will feature prominently, there's also other matters, right? Socio-economic issues that I imagine these countries want to tackle. Many nations in the world have been dealing with crippling cost of living crises. And I suppose one would guess that world leaders would want to find solutions to those problems, even at gatherings like these.
Yes, you know that the war in Ukraine has affected the supply chain, and therefore it will be critical for the leaders to engage President Putin. And I think President Putin would want to engage leaders, particularly President Ramaphosa, representing the continent in terms of his intention to continue to support Africa in relation to the food supply. You know that the fertilizers, the grain coming from Russia, he made a commitment that he will continue to assist the continent. So I think this is going to be key. But also with leaders from the Middle East, he is going to talk about support for Palestinians in relation to the humanitarian assistance. You know that he has done that already. But also I think this meeting comes at a time where yesterday there was a breakthrough when China and India agreed to resolve their standoff in relation to the border. And now this has paved way for a more conducive and welcoming environment for all the leaders, because the elephant in the room has been resolved. That is the tension between China and India. And we saw earlier on the arrival of the Prime Minister of India and immediately the arrival of the President of China, Xi Jinping. And therefore you can see that, yes, it is going to be a big day today, and President Ramaphosa is expected to have a one-on-one or bilateral meeting with President Putin at lunchtime today. And I think they are going to talk about Middle East. They are going to talk about the war in Ukraine. They are going to talk about the coming G20. As you know that both South Africa and Russia are members of the G20. The G20 this year is in Brazil, but next year G20 is in South Africa. South Africa is taking over the presidency of the G20 in December. I think they are going to discuss that. You know that President Putin decided that he's not going to attend the G20 in Brazil to make things easy for President Lula. And President Lula this time around can't even attend the BRICS meeting because of the injury over the weekend. But these are some of the issues that President Ramaphosa is going to engage President Putin on, because that G20 meeting will be quite important for developing nations.
Without a doubt, in fact, you've read my mind. Those are the two issues I was going to raise next, but perhaps let's just choose one of them. The last time the BRICS Summit was held, of course, it was here in South Africa. President Putin couldn't arrive because of very serious political issues, and in fact, there was a lot of debate about whether or not he'd pitch up. I wonder if there are any of those kind of complications this time around. You've mentioned that President Lula won't be there, but it doesn't seem to be because of a contentious issue like an imminent arrest, you know? So to what extent are any of those kind of issues, do you reckon, clouding potentially any of the talks that might happen in Russia?
Well, you are correct. President Putin will not be attending the G20 meeting in Brazil later this year. Now, the issue is What about South Africa? We saw during the BRICS Summit, there was an agreement that President Putin shouldn't attend. He took that decision to make things easier for South Africa. I suspect we are likely going to see a similar situation where President Putin will have a discussion with President Ramaphosa in terms of what needs to happen next year. Clearly, the announcement might not be now in terms of his next plan, in terms of the G20 in South Africa. But I think towards that summit next year, the G20, he is going to take a similar decision as long as that warrant of arrest is still there. You saw him talking about that warrant of arrest when he was engaging media just before the summit, that it's strange that he has to deal with this issue. But the very same International Criminal Court is delaying to issue a warrant of arrest against the role players in the Middle East question, particularly the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. But the very same court was quick to issue a warrant of arrest for President Putin that has paralyzed his movements. But here is Benjamin Netanyahu flying all over the world without fear because there's no warrant of arrest. And therefore, this speaks to this unipolar danger where one country is so powerful and all the friends of that country can do as they want. And that is why the issue of the multipolar world becomes so critical.
Fascinating as always. We're watching the space with the rest of your team without a doubt as that summit gets underway in Russia. But for now, thanks very much indeed, Sophie Mokoena, our international desk editor here at SABC News.